Great. All right, gang. First of all, happy Monday. Good to see everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining for my roughly twice a year talk about ethics, which is I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with, so happy to talk about it. I'm not always great at seeing the chat box when I'm sharing my slides, so if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt, or if you want to drop it in the chat box, then Kelly or Chantry, either of you can just interrupt and say, hey, there's kind of a question here, or I'll definitely leave questions at the end. I know we have a handful of case presentations. I can have the habit of talking fast when I know there's a time limit, so I'm going to try to stay on topic, but also not talk too fast. So typically when I present on ethics, what I usually do is kind of focus on a couple of different codes and then have some case examples set up for all of those. Today's going to be a little bit different. Today's really just a day of highlights. So I'm going to discuss the NADAC NCC AP Code of Ethics. They just were updated this past June, which is great. We're going to look at their code specifically specific to advocacy, which is great. And that code of ethics has the most about advocacy that I know of. So really happy about that. And then I'm going to highlight a specific ethical decision-making model that just came my way thanks to Jenny Cayley. Jenny, I don't know if you're on the call, but if you are, super grateful that you sent this my way. So we're going to be able to kind of have an introduction to that together. So most likely, I didn't see who signed up for the call today or who's on, but most likely there's various codes of professional ethics that are represented in this Zoom room today, which is kind of one of the many reasons I love sharing this Learn space. So in general, code of ethics serve as a guide for all of us. If we use the analogy of traveling down a path with multiple forks in the road, we want to rely on our guidebook to sort of help us decide which path to take based on what we're trying to achieve in that journey today. So for example, this is a picture of our late pup, Nellie. She chose one path, and their sleepy cows have chosen a different path that day. And so essential tools, as we're using these guidebooks, here's what we need to bring with us. We need to have self-awareness of our own moral codes. We need to be able to balance kind of our own inner moral pathway with external guidance provided by our professional codes, provided by that guidebook. We want to be able to have a personal guide along the way to kind of help us interpret and apply codes of ethics to specific contexts. So that would be like a supervisor or a consultation group. And then having a solid decision-making model to refer back to. In past presentations, I really have focused on the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics because that's one of the codes that I adhere to. But today I'm going to focus on the other code I follow, which is the NADAC NCC AP Code of Ethics. Sometimes out of laziness, I'm just going to call it the NADAC Code of Ethics because as you can see, there are so many letters. So NADAC is the Association for Addiction Professionals. As you can see, that name does not line up with the letters that represent it. It was formerly known as the National Association for Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counselors. They updated their name for a couple different reasons, and for good reason. Part of it's also because the professionals that they represent have expanded just so much. It's not just counselors they're representing. It's counselors, it's educators, other addiction-focused healthcare professionals. So they wanted to make sure that name properly represented that group. The NCCAP is the National Certification Commission for Addiction Professionals. And so together they have the shared code of ethics. Like I mentioned, the code was just updated this past June 2025 to meet the needs of current addiction practice. And one of the big changes is that the standards that they talked about were replaced with principles. And then another big change to the code is that they now have a whole principle section, Principle 10, dedicated to National Certified Peer Recovery Support Specialists, which is fantastic. I think I've mentioned in past ethics talks that hopefully what happens is that our codes change and should change as a reflection of kind of social and cultural shifts. And that's a great example of that. So once upon a time, we didn't, peers weren't a part of the treatment landscape, so they weren't needed to be included in the code of ethics, but now they are a part of our treatment landscape, so they need to be there. In fact, I can't even imagine not having them in our treatment field anymore. So NADAC is one of my favorite definitions of ethics. I know I've shared it in this room before, and I'm going to share it again for folks that haven't heard it before. So ethics are generally regarded as the standards that govern the conduct of a person. Smith and Hodges define ethics as a human reflecting self-consciously on the act of being a moral being. This implies a process of self-reflection and awareness of how to behave as a moral being. Some definitions are dictated by law, individual belief systems, religion, or a mixture of all three. So one of the aspects of this that can be challenging is that word moral, because so many things can alter our perception of what we consider moral. And what your personal views are on certain topics can sometimes clash against what is your professional obligation in terms of advocacy, which we're going to talk about later. And so in addition to theirs, I think there's like 11 or 12, probably need to be fact checked on that, how many principles there are in the code. They also, NADAC recommends consideration of these specific standards when you're making your ethical decisions. So they want you to think about autonomy, obedience, conscientious refusal, beneficence, gratitude, competence, justice, stewardship, and honesty and candor. Some of you may remember, I think it was 2 codes of ethics updates ago that the list actually used to include 16, but they have whittled that down to having these 9. So we'll turn specifically to advocacy and talk about what this code says about that. I'm going to take a little watering hole break. Okay. I'm happy to report that the NADAC Code of Ethics has several codes related to advocacy. I won't read through them all because seriously, that's how many there are. But I'm going to try to highlight aspects of all of them. So for example, under Principle 1, which is the counseling relationship, the advocacy code states that addiction professionals advocate on behalf of clients at individual, group, institutional, and community levels. Going on to Principle 3, which is the informative or professional responsibilities and workplace standards. Their informative advocacy says that addiction professionals are aware of society's prejudice and stigma towards people with SUD and advocate for opportunities and choices. Under Principle 4, which is working in a culturally diverse world, this is where the code starts to broaden out and reminds us that we must advocate for the needs of the diverse populations we serve. And then I have these listed here not because they are any less important to advocacy. They just don't speak, they're not speaking specifically to advocacy, but just how we should be providing treatment in that same open-minded way that we should be advocating. So there's a whole code about diversity and that we must provide culturally responsive and culturally sensitive services. There's a section on discrimination. I'm sorry, there's a couple of different codes on discrimination. And then they actually have an entire principle about working in a culturally diverse world, which I love. Now that term advocacy is so broad, right? And because it's so broad, it can either be really overwhelming to think about all the ways that we should be advocating, or the hope is, with some reframe, it can be relieving to think about all the creative ways that we get to advocate. I'm going to borrow the social work framework for practice to guide us in how we can kind of categorize the different ways we can advocate. And let me shout out Sarah Leifheit. I'm not sure if she's on here or not, but she was my social work guru and answered my, am I saying this right? Questions when I was talking about the framework, because I'm not a social work, but she's one of the best ones I know. So thank you, Sarah. So their kind of framework includes micro, meso, and macro levels of practice. And so refers to the 3 practice levels that social work takes place in. And then again, I'm going to use this kind of talk about the different ways we can advocate. So the micro level typically describes working on a smaller scale and figuring out ways that we can impact clients on an individual basis. So this is about working with folks one-on-one and small groups, exploring ways to meet their individualized needs, etc. That meso level is a bit broader and focuses on problem solving on maybe behalf of client systems. So examples could be collaborating with other agencies in your community or creating specialty programs within your agency. And then that macro level work addresses the challenges of alleviating societal problems at the systems level to improve quality of life. So this is our change. This is our way to affect change at a much, much larger level. Now, here's the thing. I'm sharing these slides with you all mostly as reminders, or certainly in case you want to use these for your own advocacy talk. But I know a lot of you, in fact, all of you are already incredible advocates for your patients. In fact, being here today is an example of advocating, right? When we educate ourselves, when we continue in our personal education, when we contribute to the education of others, just like for you all, they're going to be sharing case presentations later. Those are totally examples of advocating. So here's some brief examples of micro-level advocacy. Again, this list is meant to remind you of the great work you already do at this level, and then also think about other potential ideas you could bring into your practice or agency. So examples would be helping a patient find and apply for housing, coordinating referrals to other healthcare providers for a patient, educating your patients on destigmatizing language regarding substance use disorder, providing support letters to patients working with other agencies, connecting your patient to transportation services, role-playing with a patient on how to speak up for themselves, and then correcting misinformation about addiction when you hear it, even in the general community. I will say that this micro level is, I think, is where I see the most kind of blurred lines in terms of what is and isn't ethical for us to do on behalf of our patients. So can we help our patients find housing? Absolutely. Can we let them move into our basement? No. I don't know if anybody's seen Shrinking, that's a TV show on Apple. I love it. It's one of my favorite shows. He moves his patient into his pool house. Not such a great idea. Can we connect them to resources that provide them financial support for utilities? Absolutely. Do we want to add them to our own family cell phone plan? Absolutely not. Can we donate to local charitable foundations that we know our patients utilize? Absolutely, yes. Should we hand them money directly from our wallets on a weekly basis? No. But just some examples of things that pop. So here are a few examples of meso-level advocacy. So things like creating a low barrier clinic within your agency for patients with opioid use disorder that have been unable to adhere to your traditional MAT program. That's an example. Connecting various outreach agencies within your community, giving a presentation on substance use disorder to your local school board council, or creating a collegiate recovery program. Those would be examples of that kind of middle level advocacy. And then some examples of macro level advocacy. This would be things like reaching out to your senators to discuss your professional perspective on MOUD and MAT, organizing a group to advocate for a new public service in your state, conducting research centered on social determinants of health, and then using that research to inform policymakers. Lobbying for new laws related to telehealth services, related to SUD care, and then developing initiatives to address community-wide stigma. Shout out to Jeremy Sagan. I think it was our last hub and spoke call that we had. He had reached out. You know, he said, "Hey, listen, how can we help? Are there people at the legislative level that we can talk to about the care that we're giving?" Now, again, we forgot to talk about one more level, and you could argue it's the most important level, the self level. Now, did I make this level up? Technically, yes, I did. It is technically not a part of that social work framework, but the idea of self-care as advocacy is definitely not new. We all know that self-care is vital, and self-care is another way that we can advocate, because when we take care of ourselves, that puts us in the position to be able and allow us to show up for other people. So an example of advocacy is getting rest. Not shaming yourself for not attending a recent local protest, which I had already heard from some folks just in the last week, the way they were beating themselves up for not getting to this event. Recognizing internal bias and addressing it in supervision. Eating foods that assist your body in feeling well, which is different for all of us. Staying up to date with professional ethics. Again, what you're doing today is a great example of that. volunteering or not shaming yourself for not volunteering. So small list of things that you can do for yourself. I'm going to take another little watering break, please hold. Okay, let's wrap up by talking about decision-making models. So the NADAC NCC AP Code of Ethics state that addiction professionals should utilize an ethical decision-making model when faced with an ethical dilemma. And they offer these kind of bits of guidance on the aspects that a model should have. So they say there should be some level of supervision or consultation regarding the concern. There should be a consideration of relevant ethical standards, principles, and laws. There should be a generation. What you should be able to do is kind of develop a couple of different potential courses of actions to examine. You then will kind of look at the risks and benefits of each of those potential courses of action, using that to then decide on an objective decision based on the circumstances and welfare of all involved, and then reflection upon or redirection when necessary after implementing the decision. So I want to highlight a specific model that was just published 2 months ago in the Journal of Rural Mental Health, and it's called the DEESC model. And again, a special thank you to Jenny, I'm not sure if she's on here, who sent this my way. So the authors of this model point out that working in rural settings presents unique challenges. And so this model is designed to address those specific challenges. So it recognizes the unique cultural, geographic, and socioecological dynamics of rural communities and considers itself a place-based ethical decision-making framework, which I like that term. I had not heard that before reading about this one. So as they pointed out, rural places make up 80% of the landmass in the US. And yet, as you all well understand, the residents of rural places have a greater untreated mental health needs, fewer resources available to them. They experience fears around confidentiality, and they have very valid concerns about the cost of care. Among the most kind of common ethical challenge reported by rural providers are navigating dual relationships, which I know we've talked about in our ethics talks several times before, maintaining client confidentiality, and then operating within the appropriate scope of practice. So the DEESC model stands for do no harm, examine ethical codes, examine motives, seek consultation, and consent. This model is different than other models in that it's not that you go through this, step 1 and then step 2 and then step 3. It's actually this repetitive process where the provider explores the ethical challenge through each lens of the model and then kind of revisits each of the lens going forward as they're developing more understanding. And so we start with that commitment to do no harm. So for example, when we are considering expanding boundaries or engaging in dual relationships with a patient, which happens a lot in rural settings, it's got to honor that commitment to doing no harm. We then examine ethical codes. So what codes apply here? How does that rural community intersect with those codes? Going back to doing no harm, seeing if we've made any changes to kind of our potential course of action, and then is there any harm involved? Examine our motives. So we practice honest self-reflection, considering our own cultural biases, the diverse perspectives involved in the dilemma, and focus on place-based ethics. Again, this phrase I love. Again, trying as much as possible all along the way to seeking consultation and or supervision. That looks different for all of us. This part can especially be hard to do in a rural area because sometimes you're the only provider there. Sometimes, because it's, again, a small town, there may be a conflict of interest between who you're choosing to go to for supervision or consultation and the person you're having that ethical dilemma with. So sometimes the internet can be our best way of finding organizations that can provide those kinds of consultation connections. And then finally, reviewing with the client the risk and benefits of the informed consent process for the decision we're making. And we ask for their voice in contributing to the cultural context that we're gathering. So again, thanks to Jenny for finding that. So those were, again, my highlights. I didn't have any specific examples. I think it's great timing that this is the day that we have 3 case examples. So I do think one of them that was sent, it's potential that we're going to be able to tie in a little bit to the advocacy piece. So you've seen the slide before. I will share it again because I need these reminders, so some of you may as well. As providers, we are going to make mistakes because we are human. We may want to help everyone that we can, but we may need to accept that that's not always possible. As providers, we cannot know everything. We cannot expect ourselves to, which is why we continue this learning journey every day. And that we cannot and should not do this tough work alone. We really need and deserve the support of our colleagues and our peers in the field. That's my slides. Let me look to see if I missed any. I see no questions in the chat box.
All right, guys, do we have any questions? All righty. Well, thank you so much for presenting that.
Yeah.
Providing all that information to the group.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right, guys, so we have 3, oh, wrong button. All right, we have 3 case presentations today. Jen Boyd, do you want to go first?
I can do it.
All right, let me share my screen. That might be helpful.